Hi everyone, good afternoon, and welcome back to part 2 of our pre-Purim series Lunch and Learn here with United Synagogue. Thank you everyone for joining, and it's great to be back here. Today we're going to be talking about the villains of the Purim story. Last week we talked about the heroes, we talked about Mordechai, Esther, Charvona, and of course God as the ultimate hero of the Purim story. And if you missed it, you can watch it with here on the United Synagogue's Facebook page or on the USTV website. Today we're going to talk about the villains, and we discussed last week that debate in the Gemara that's codified in our law in the Shulchan Aruch, that on Purim we are obligated to say, blessed is Mordechai and Esther, our heroes, and cursed is Haman and Zeresh, our villains. And we talked about really how do we do this and what does it mean, but the idea that it's there in our law shows that it's really important to know who the goodies and the baddies of the Purim story, that we're not just doing this as something interesting, but we're doing it because it's really fundamental to what Purim is all about. And we talked about how we can fulfill this requirement with the song that we sing at the end of hearing the Megilla. So you remember we talked about how at the end of the Megilla, often people are sort of hurrying up, gathering their things, getting ready to go and begin their busy Purim day. And there's a few among us who might actually read the poem that we're meant to read after hearing the Megillah. And there's a song, Shoshanat Yaakov, that we do tend to sing out loud with a really nice upbeat song. And if I share my slides with you, I can bring back here the ending of this Shoshanat Yaakov song. As I showed you last week, we end with the words, cursed be Haman, who sought to destroy me, blessed be Mordechai the Jew, cursed be Zeresh, the wife of Haman, who terrified me, and blessed be Esther. And we see therefore here who the goodies and the baddies of the Purim story are. So today we're going to talk about Haman and Zeresh, given that they are mentioned here as our key villains. But I also want to add another question here this week. We have, seemingly in contrast to that halacha that we have to say, cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai, we also have a very interesting halacha, which is very popular among some, certain age groups and certain demographics of the Jewish community. The idea that the Rava, one of the rabbis in the Gemara, says in Megillah 7b that someone is obligated to become intoxicated, to become drunk on Purim until they don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman, which is really interesting. So hold on, are we meant to know who we're cursing and blessing? Or are we not meant to know who we're cursing and blessing? It seems to be in contrast to each other. So keep this in mind as we go through our shir now. And I will answer the question, well, at least give my answer, there may be many, at the end. And I'm really interested to know if anyone else has any different answers. I also should point out this idea of getting drunk on Purim until we don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman is obviously a big debate. What does this mean? How drunk are we really meant to get? Are we actually obligated to drink so much? And there's all sorts of different opinions. For example, one opinion is that you can fulfill the obligation by going to sleep, because when you're asleep, you don't know the difference between the goodies and the baddies. So it's not clear that, yes, we all need to get so drunk. So it is important to make that distinction. But again, so are we meant to know who the villains and the heroes are, or are we not meant to know? That's the question to keep in mind. And as I said, we're going to answer it at the end. So last week we looked at the heroes. Today we're going to look at the villains, and we're going to talk about Haman and Zeresh, as I already mentioned, and then we're going to talk about Achashverosh, and is he a villain or not? Because it's actually not so straightforward. So we will debate him. So to begin with Haman now. Haman is undoubtedly the archetypal villain of the Purim story. In fact, he's not even the villain of the Purim story. He's the villain overall. I mean, we use the phrase the modern day Hamans as well sometimes. I have to tell you, even my 3-year-old daughter knows that Haman is the baddie. And in fact, she's been walking around nonstop the last few days going Haman, and then we're all expected to boo and stamp our feet. She was very excited about how to boo Haman. And if she knows that, then really he is clearly the villain. There's no debate about whether he's a villain or not. What we're going to look at now together is why is he the villain, and what does he really do, or why does he do it that makes him so evil? So we're introduced to Haman in Esther chapter 3. And he is introduced as follows. Esther chapter 3 verse 1. אחר הדברים האלה גידל המלך אחשוורוש את המן בן המדתה האגגי. It was after these things that King Ahasuerus promoted Haman. And it's actually really interesting because the verse continues to say that he was promoted above all the others officials. He really was given the highest position. And it's interesting because we don't get a reason. There's no reason given as to why he was promoted. And we haven't heard his name until now. So who is he that all of a sudden he's being promoted to the most important position in the empire after King Ahasuerus? And that leads us to question, really, did he deserve it? Where's he come from? What's going on? But he's called so Haman ben Hamdata Agagi, as I've put here for you in red letters. So who is this? Now, the Targum, the Aramaic translation of Megillat Esther, and as we know, there's no such thing as translation without interpretation. And the Targum on Esther specifically really interprets and adds a lot of extra commentaries and midrashim and extra explanations. He says that he was from the people of Amalek. And we know that Agag was the name of the king of Amalek in back of many generations before the Purim story. We have the whole story of King Saul, Shaul HaMelech, fighting the Amalekites. And we know that Amalek has been a traditional enemy of the Jewish people back. They were the first nation to attack us in the desert after we left Egypt. And there was many wars fought between the Jewish people and Amalek over the years. And in the time of King Saul, the first king of Israel, Shaul HaMelech, in the book of Samuel, he had the opportunity to really defeat the Amalekites for good and once and for all. However, he left Agag, the king of Amalek, alive one more night. And that was a mistake. And there's that's what we read in Haftorah on Parshat Zachor, the Shabbat that we just had. That was a Haftorah that we read after the special Torah reading of remembering the evil that Amalek did to us when they attacked us after we left Egypt. So we know there's a whole history between Amalek and the Jewish people. And the fact that Haman is called the Agagite, which is the same name of that king Agag of Amalek that Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, left alive, really is probably why Targum is telling us that he is an Amalekite. Haman is descendant from this nation of Amalek that really, really hate the Jewish people, a big enemy of the Jewish people. Now, it has been suggested that maybe he wasn't a literal descendant of Amalek, but that he was a continuation of that ideology. We don't know exactly, but it's clear that he really is an enemy of the Jewish people. Why does Haman hate the Jewish people so much? Why does Haman hate the Jewish people so much? So, as I've just said, there's that historical enmity between Amalek and the people of Israel, which clearly has been going on for many generations. And we see now this sort of continuation of it, especially because I want to point out to you that Mordechai comes from the tribe of Binyamin, and Shaul HaMelech was from the tribe of Binyamin. And we're told by our sages that Mordechai was a descendant of King Saul, of Shaul HaMelech, that king who left Agag, the king of Amalek, alive that one more night. And therefore, if Haman is a descendant on one side of the Amalekite king Agag, and we see Mordechai as a descendant on the other side of the Jewish king Shaul, we can really see that sort of battle many generations ago between Agag and Shaul is continued now in the time of the Purim story between Mordechai and Haman. And this is really that opportunity to right the wrong, to bring about the end of the Amalekites through the tribe of Binyamin and rectify the mistake that Shaul made those many, many generations ago. We see also that Haman really comes from lower down the social ladder. We're told that he has a very inferior social position and he has to fight to rise the social ladder. Therefore, he's a bit insecure about his position. And actually, he's probably very jealous of Mordechai because he's a descendant of kings and therefore has a much higher social position already. And there's this also personal tension between them and jealousy and hatred from Haman to Mordechai. There's one more midrash that I'd like to share. The Agada, there's also a link between Mordechai and Haman can be linked to the battle between Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov and Esav were the twin sons of Yitzchak and Rivka, who fought their whole lives, even they were fighting in the womb, we're told. And we have this story of Esav coming in very famished from hunting and wanting the food that Yaakov is cooking. And it links to this really fascinating midrash that we have about Mordechai and Haman. So let's read this. It's quite long, but I'd like to read it for you so you can see it from the source. There was a quarrel between them, Mordechai and Haman. In the days of Ezra, when the Jews were rebuilding Jerusalem's walls, enemies came and obstructed them. Now, this is really interesting. If we just pause for a moment in the source, there's often a debate of the time, when did the Purim story happen? Did it happen during the exile, before the Jews were allowed to return after the Babylonian exile to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple? Or did it happen after the Jews were already allowed to go back and begin rebuilding the temple? It's a big debate. And this source is implying that the Purim story happened after Ezra, after the time of the beginning of the Second Temple period, when the Jews are already rebuilding Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, and but many choose not to come and choose to stay in the Persian Empire in Shushan and be there for the Purim story. So anyway, it's part of a big debate, and it's really a share for a whole other time, but I just wanted to point it out that there are many sources that have different opinions on when the Purim story was actually taking place. So going back to this midrash, the Jews are rebuilding the temple and the non-Jewish enemies come and say, you're building without permission of the king. You're not allowed to do this. And the Jews replied, but it is with his permission. And the enemy said, select one of your men and we will select one of ours and let them present this before the king. And the non-Jews selected Haman, and the Jews selected Mordechai. So they're both preparing provisions. They're both traveling to the king to ask whether the Jews can indeed rebuild the temple or not. And we're told that Mordechai ate his bread in small morsels, trying to make it last, while Haman ate carelessly and ran out of food. He approached Mordechai and asked to borrow bread from him, but he hesitated to lend him a loaf, and Mordechai then said, if I give you a loaf, will you sell yourself to me? Yes, said Haman, but we have no parchment on which to write the deed. And Mordechai responded, here is my shoe, write upon it. And thereupon Haman wrote on Mordechai's shoe. This is a bit blocked out. I wonder if we can move the way that thank you very much. I, Haman the Agagite, am slave to Mordechai the Jew, to whom I sold myself for a loaf of bread. So it's really fascinating, a real insight into these characters. We have Haman, who, we have Mordecai, who is very planned and organized and will eat carefully to make sure that he has provisions for the whole journey. And Haman just living for the moment, eating it all and not planning ahead. And then Haman becomes so hungry that he's willing to sell himself into servitude in order to get food. And this reminds us of that story that I mentioned of Yaakov and Esav. Yaakov is cooking his lentils, and Esav comes in and says, "I'm so hungry, give me lentil soup." And Yaakov says, "Only if you sell me your birthright." And Esav is willing to sell his birthright in order to get a bowl of soup. So we see this link between Haman and Esav, both willing to sell something of huge importance, their freedom or their birthright, for some food. And that's an insight into the real contrast and rivalry between them. And we'll mention this story again in a moment. But even more, if we go back to our question of why does Haman hate the Jewish people so much, so we've seen the historical national enmity between them. We've seen the link to the sort of tension between Yaakov and Esav, but also this insecurity, this personal insecurity that Haman has that fuels his anger. We see the two characters are total opposites. And it's as if Haman knows this. And it really, the insecurity over Haman's position allows him to be so greatly affected by Mordecai's refusal to bow down to him. Why does Haman care that Mordecai won't bow down to him? We talked a little bit about this last week. But why does it bother Haman so much that he wants to have revenge on the entire Jewish people because one Jew won't bow down to him? And we see this really clearly in this source. Towards the end of the story, Esther invites Haman and the king to a private banquet, a real intimate banquet, just the three of them, as you can see in this image on the screen. And Haman leaves really happy. It's the only time in the Megillah that we see Haman is happy. V'yetze Haman b'yom hahu sameach v'tov lev. He leaves happy. But what happens? He sees Mordecai as he leaves the palace, and Mordecai doesn't bow to him. Not even that, he doesn't even nod his head. He doesn't show any sign of recognition, no respect, nothing. And what does it do to Haman? All that happiness disappears, and it's filled with rage. He sees red. Haman al Mordecai chema. He becomes so angry. So angry that he goes home and he can't talk about anything else to his wife apart from how annoying Mordecai is. And it just doesn't make sense, because you would see this evening as the height of his career. He's just spent an evening, had a fancy banquet alone with the king and the queen. What could be more a greater sign of success that you made it? He should say, who cares about Mordecai? I don't care what he thinks of me or what he does, but it really grates on him. It really bothers Haman because he's so insecure. And in fact, Erica Brown, in her amazing book about Esther, says his happiness was rooted in the same source that drove him to rage, his insecurity. When his ego was stoked, he was blissful. When his ego was threatened, he was angry beyond belief. It's because of how angry he is and how great the impact on his ego that Haman's wife and friends advise him to kill Mordecai by hanging, not just privately, but on a massive gallows so that everyone would see. He would be a deterrent for anyone else wanting to insult Haman, showing that this is all tied up with Haman's insecurity and his ego. And by the way, the Targum, again, the Aramaic translation on this verse that I just showed you, on this verse, explains why was Haman so angry. I just asked, it doesn't make sense that he's so angry. So the Targum explains he's so angry because of that story. Because when Mordecai, every time Haman sees Mordecai, it's not just that Mordecai won't bow, but Mordecai raises his foot and shows him that deed, that deal on which Haman wrote on his shoe, I am selling myself to you as a slave for this loaf of bread. And that's what really bothers Haman every time he sees Mordecai. But the idea that Haman would endanger an entire people for his ego is just unthinkable. But we've seen that Haman really is a villain on a national level. He has his hatred of the Jewish people, but also on a personal level, he allows his insecurities and his ego fuel this anger at Mordechai and to the whole Jewish people. So clearly, we've seen that Haman is certainly a villain. Now let's talk about Zeresh, our second villain. Zeresh, Haman's wife. We really don't know very much about her, so we're not going to spend long talking about her at all. She appears really in only one scene in the Megillah. After what we've just discussed, after that banquet, when Mordechai really bothers Haman as Haman leaves so much, he goes home, and who's there? His wife and his closest advisors. That he just rants and vents about how annoyed he is about Mordechai, and we see Zeresh, his wife's response. Now, before we look at her response, who is she? So all the text tells us is that Zeresh is Ishto, his wife Zeresh, but that Aramaic translation and commentary, the Targum adds on that she was the daughter of Tatnai, who was a governor of a province over the Euphrates River. And who was Tatnai? He's mentioned in the book of Ezra as being a governor who questions the Jewish people's rebuilding of the temple in the time of Ezra. So we see that Zeresh comes from a family who are already a bit, I wouldn't say an enemy, but already causing problems for the Jewish people by questioning, wait, what are you doing? Are you really meant to be rebuilding the temple? And Yosef ibn Yahya, a medieval commentator, adds onto his commentary that Zeresh's father actually hated the Jewish people. So she's coming from a family already with this inbuilt dislike of the Jewish people. So when she hears what Haman is saying, she doesn't hesitate. And her response is, build a gallows and hang Mordechai. Go to speak to the king in the morning, but tonight already start building. And straight away he does. And it's very interesting. The text, verse 14 here says, his wife and his friends said to him, build a gallows. But our commentators say that it says Zeresh is first, his wife speaks first, and then they agree that really it was her plan all along to kill Mordechai on the gallows. And there are midrashic sources that tell us that Zeresh suggested hanging because she knew that other people who tried to kill the Jews throughout history in different ways hadn't succeeded, but no one had ever tried death by hanging. So that's why she suggests that. She knows about the Jewish people, she knows about the history, and it really shows, her knowledge shows the extent of her dislike and hatred. But I think really we can see Zeresh, that's all we know about her, that's all we're really told about her. And perhaps, so she's one of these minor characters who acts as a foil. In literature, we talk about minor characters being a foil to emphasize a flaw or a good point of a major character, of a central character. So Zeresh, in her wickedness is accentuating Esther's bravery and courage and her goodness. And it reminds me of the Gemara in Sanhedrin. There's a Gemara in Sanhedrin 110a that talks about the power of a woman to lead her husband to do good or to do bad by contrasting two women of the same generation in the desert, in the Midbar. During the time, the 40 years wandering in the desert, Korach led a rebellion against Moshe Rabbeinu. And we see that Korach's wife urged him on and encouraged him to lead this rebellion, which led to his downfall. He died as a result of this rebellion. In contrast, we see a man called On Ben Pelet, who joins a rebellion but then wants to get out, and he's not really sure how to, and his wife says, I'll help you. And what she does is she makes him hide in the tent, and she sits outside the entrance to their tent with her hair uncovered, and she sits and does her weaving or sewing or something, so that the men, the Korach and his men, can't come and get On Ben Pelet to go with them to their revolt against Moshe. And that saves her husband's life. And the Gemara contrasts these two women as examples of how a woman can have a positive or a negative influence on those around her. And I think this is a very strong message also when we look at the difference between Zeresh and Esther, especially if we take it to the next level. When Zeresh says, build gallows on which to hang Mordechai, we discussed last week the next part of the story. Last week, we talked about how when Achashverosh hears about Haman and his wickedness and his wicked plan against the Jewish people, he's so angry. And Charvona pipes up and says, oh, there's these gallows. And the king immediately orders that Haman should be executed and put to death upon those same gallows. And perhaps if it weren't for that, he wouldn't have been killed so quickly, and maybe he'd have wormed his way out of it, bribed his way out of it, we don't know. But therefore, you could argue that by telling Haman to build these gallows that night, Zeresh was actually signing her husband's death warrant. She was actually causing his ultimate downfall, just like Korach's wife urging him on to his rebellion was leading him to his death too. So it's just interesting to think about the power of our influence on those around us. And I don't mean it's just a woman able to influence her husband, and we're all able to influence, men and women alike are able to influence all the people around us in many different ways, and we should always try and be a positive influence where we can. So now that we've talked about Haman and we've talked about Zeresh, I'd like us to talk about Achashverosh quickly. This will be the last character to talk about. And it's really hard to know how to view Achashverosh, the king of the story. Is he a savior, given that eventually he is the one who saves the Jewish people from annihilation, as the Queen Esther requests? Or is he a villain for allowing Haman to do whatever he wants to the Jewish people in the first place? Chazal themselves, our sages themselves, are also unsure on how to view Achashverosh, and there's many different opinions, and I'm going to try and share the range of opinions with you now. If I bring up my next slide, we can see that Achashverosh, at a very basic level, is depicted as a leader who loves partying, who loves drinking. You can see here this image of him in this painting on your screen is of him fairly drunk, perhaps at a banquet. I mean, we're introduced to him at the beginning of our story, where he leads this extensive feast and party that goes on for 6 months. I mean, can you imagine the equivalent of our government wanting to have a party for 6 months? It would be outrageous. I mean, he was running the country, the empire, during this time. And he's very vain, he's very rich, and he wants to show that off to people. Now, there are instances where he is a bit generous, but we also see him as having very high taxation, really causing poverty in his people because of his high taxes. We see that he doesn't have very good marriages, but then perhaps we could argue that no ancient king had good marriages. And certainly he acts rashly. He really does. He makes quick decisions in his anger and possibly regrets them later. For example, getting rid of Vashti at the beginning of the Megilla, he regrets that later. So we see that he acts on the advice of people around him, possibly without thinking too much about it. So this quote on your screen here is from a modern Bible scholar who calls him a pompous windbag, whose main concern in life is an endless stream of all-night drunken revels and so on. And perhaps that's a bit harsh, but we certainly are given this impression of him in the Megillah. On the next level, so perhaps at best, we could call him a very vain, harsh leader, possibly a bit of a drunkard, party goer, and so on. That's sort of at best. But then if we look at him a bit more in depth, we could also see this callous and insensitive nature. For example, straight after saying to Haman, do with the Jews as you wish, we see Hamelech v'Haman yashvu lishtot. They sat down to eat and drink. And to contrast this, to emphasize my point of the insensitivity of this, we are taught in our halacha that a Sanhedrin, that passes a death penalty may not eat or drink for the rest of the day, because we understand that even if the death penalty is necessary, it's still not a good thing, and it's still something that we should be sensitive to. But here Haman and Achashverosh have agreed to kill an entire people, and they sit down to drink. It's just very, very callous. Although I should point out that there is a commentator, the Malbim, says that the fact that they sat down to eat together here and feast shows that the king did not understand what Haman really intended to do, and we'll discuss that a bit more in a moment. But was he actually an enemy of the Jews, or was he just not such a nice man? So this is debated at length in the Gemara, especially in Megilla 11a. And one of the opinions given of Rav, they discuss his name. What's the name Achashverosh? Where does it come from? What does it mean? So one of the opinions given by Rav here is that it means Achiv Shel Rosh, the brother of Rosh, of the head. And who's called Rosh? Nebuchadnezzar. In the book of Daniel, we have a quote where Rosh is used to refer to Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian leader who killed many Jews and destroyed the temple. The first temple. Now, obviously, it's not possible for Achashverosh, a Persian emperor, to be the brother of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. But by equating them, the Gemara, our sages are telling us that they are equal in their wickedness. And just like Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple, Achashverosh prevented it being rebuilt. Just like Nebuchadnezzar killed Jewish people, Achashverosh tried to kill Jewish people. We also see another opinion of Rabbi Yochanan that his name means that everyone became poor. Rush means poor, that he impoverished people through his heavy taxation. But that was Jews and non-Jews alike, so that's not really saying that he was an enemy of the Jews. But then we also have this final opinion that I want to share with you here from the Megillah 11a, is that who Achashverosh means he was wicked from the beginning until the end. But even stronger than this, so we're trying to go up in levels of how much of a villain he was. There's a source in Esther Rabbah where we're told that Achashverosh hated Israel more than Haman the wicked. And it's interesting because Achashverosh is often not seen as the real baddie. But here, this source is showing that he's even worse than Haman, who we said at the beginning was undoubtedly a villain. But I'd like to end off just pointing out a really fascinating discussion brought up in an article by Rav Yonatan Grossman, which you can find online. He has a really interesting discussion of whether Achashverosh actually knew the extent of Haman's plan or not. He provides a very strong argument to say that actually Achashverosh was deliberately misled by Haman, who used ambiguous language and didn't really make it clear that he wanted to kill the Jewish people. We see this from the slide, the sources, the psukim, the verses on your screen. Because when Haman asks the king for permission to do something with the Jewish people, he uses the word la'avdam. Okay, now that's translated here in verse 9 as destruction. And we often think, oh, okay, that means to kill them, to destroy them. But Rav Grossman uses sources from elsewhere in Tanakh to show that that word doesn't necessarily mean to destroy them. It could be to impoverish them or to enslave them. And therefore, Achashverosh didn't really know the extent of Haman's plan. Yes, when Haman then in verse 13 here writes letters to go out to all the provinces of the empire, and he uses very clear wording, lahashmid, laharog, la'abed. There's no debate there that he's saying to kill the Jewish people, to massacre them, to exterminate them. But Achashverosh never saw those letters. They were written and sent by Haman. So therefore he's saying that Achashverosh never actually knew that Haman wanted to wipe out the Jewish people. Another proof for this, Rav Grossman says, is because when Esther reveals at the second banquet that Haman is trying to destroy her people, the king is very, very angry. He says, how could the king be so angry if he signed off that decree to kill the Jewish people? Where's this anger and shock coming from? Okay, so maybe he's shocked that Esther was included in this dangerous decree against the Jewish people because he didn't know his wife was Jewish. But then he'd be shocked, not angry, and there's real strength strong anger coming through. Therefore, Rav Grossman concludes that Achashverosh did not know that Haman wanted to actually kill them. So, if he didn't know what was going on, does that mean he's not really a villain? And I would like to answer, he is still a villain, because a king is responsible for everything that's going on. Whether he knew of Haman's plan is an interesting discussion, but essentially he's still responsible. It still shows him to be a villain, an enemy of the Jewish people, because a leader is responsible for all the actions carried out in his name. As Winston Churchill said, the price of greatness is responsibility. You don't become the emperor of 127 provinces without being responsible for what happens to the people within them. So I would like to conclude that Achashverosh should be considered a villain, just like Haman and Zeresh. But to conclude, I'd like to go back to our original question. So we asked originally, how can we put together these two contrasting halachas? One, as you can see on your slide, as I mentioned earlier, the idea that you're meant to get so drunk on Purim that you don't know the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. How can we equate that or fulfill this alongside the halacha that we saw last week, that you are meant to say cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai, and we sing at the end of the Megilla a song that fulfills that requirement? How can we put these together? And when we just looked through all the villains, we saw that these villains are really, really strong. They're really evil. And we can sort of be shocked that we were saved from these people. So I'd like to suggest that the reason we're meant to get drunk and forget the difference between Mordechai, so the blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman, is because when it comes to Purim, there's no difference between the heroes and the villains. What do I mean by this? I want to quote the Sfat Emet, who said, one is obligated to become so drunk on Purim that one cannot tell the difference between blessed be Mordechai and cursed be Haman. We thereby show that this day has nothing at all to do with our merit. It is called Purim because of the casting of lots. The fate was entirely natural and appropriate, the forces of evil having been strengthened by our own sins. But God saved us out of love alone. Because it doesn't matter who's the hero and who's the villain. Because in the end, God was always going to save us, even if no hero stepped up to sacrifice themselves to save us. God was always going to save us. And therefore, we are meant to get, I would like to suggest my own take on it, not drunk with alcohol here, but drunk with God's love for us, intoxicated on the strength of God's love, that it doesn't matter who is the goodie and who is the baddie, because God is always going to save us. But I would like to suggest then, you could say, well, then what was the purpose of this whole mini-series looking at the heroes and the villains if at the end of the day it doesn't matter because God is always going to save us because he loves us? I would like to suggest that that's unique to Purim. The rest of the year, we have an obligation to remember who is the goodie and who is the baddie, to remind us of our individual obligation to do our best, to step up, to try always to choose the right path, to sacrifice, to make sacrifices as befitting to us, to try and help people around us, to influence them for the good, and to try and always make the right choices. Throughout the year, we're meant to remember blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman, to remind us that of the strength of our individual choices. But when it comes to Purim, that one day a year, we can remember that God loves us so much that it doesn't matter if there is good or bad, he's always going to save us. And as I said, my own take is that we can become intoxicated and drunk on the love that God has for us, as the Sfat Emet has suggested. So I would like to say that I hope as we come up to Purim in a couple of days, we can keep this in mind and remember this message that ultimately we are in the hands of God, a God who loves us, and that he saved us back then and he will continue to do so in the present. And also that message that we can do always on an individual basis. We have choices every day to try and always choose the good. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, please be in touch. My email is learnwithpnina@gmail.com, and I look forward to learning more Torah with you very soon. Wishing you all Purim Sameach.